All right, everyone, we're back here live on PALS TV for another exciting week full of a variety of content. I hope you all went out and enjoyed the Memorial Day weekend, long weekend, and paid respect to those heroes that sacrificed so much to give us our freedom and allow us to do fun things like PALS TV and PALS and everything else we do here in America. So if you haven't, make sure you thank any veteran that you know and you come across, to make sure that you value what they ultimately have done for us, and that's that sacrifice. So we thank them. We're excited about our week and everything we have planned here for you. Again, we have exciting content brought to you all over the state, and a wide variety, and a lot of educational, which we're going to see here this morning, doing a little bit of art in the afternoon, and then having some fun with Heath to round out our day. So this morning, though, we're going to start over in Steubenville, Ohio, and we've heard about a lot of the history from the southern part of the state, and the Shawnees and all of that. Now we're going to learn a little bit more about the history from the eastern part of the state, and where Fort Steuben and a lot of the Native American culture also came from, and for us here in Ohio. So really looking forward to this next segment. So live from Steubenville, we have Amanda bringing you a tour of the Fort Steuben.
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Glad to see everyone. I'm here at Fort Steuben, and I'm with Paul. So Paul's going to be taking us around and showing us the fort. So let me flip my camera forward, and we can talk with Paul.
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad that you all are here virtually, and we hope to welcome you all back here to historic Fort Steuben soon. But first of all, let me just tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Paul. I'm the director of Historic Fort Steuben here and the Steubenville Visitors Center. And unfortunately, we're closed right now, but we're so excited to be able to bring you all Historic Fort Steuben virtually. So what I want to start is to tell you a little bit about why the fort is here. So we're going to point right over here, Amanda. So basically, this is a little section of Ohio that we are interested in as far as our history goes here at Historic Fort Steuben. So here's Steubenville right here. This is the northern panhandle of West Virginia, and it goes down, and this is Ohio out in this direction. Now, the reason that Historic Fort Steuben is here, actually, is because after the American Revolution in 1783,
Unmute. Okay. Can you guys hear me now? Thumbs up if you can hear me. Okay, I don't know what happened there, guys. Okay.
All right, take two. Okay. All right, so basically I'm going to tell you a little bit about historic Fort Steuben and why we're here and why our story here is important to Ohio and a national story as well. So the reason that the fort is built here is basically because after the American Revolution, after the Treaty of Paris, that basically was the treaty that ended the American Revolution and gave us our independence. Great Britain owned all this land out in the west, past the Ohio River. So basically, it's what we call the Northwest Territory. It's the land to the west of the river. So across the river over there, we have West Virginia. It's West Virginia now, but at that time it was Virginia, of course. And then you've got Ohio up here. And so basically, after the American Revolution, the federal government was broke. They didn't have a lot of money. They didn't have a lot of money even to pay the veterans and the soldiers that had served in the American Revolution. So basically, what happened was the federal government had all this land out here in the west, and they wanted to survey it. They wanted to go out and measure it, and basically sell it off to raise money for the federal government, and then sell it to developers or landowners or settlers who wanted to come out here. So basically, that's what happened. So in 1785, the federal government sent a group of soldiers and surveyors. Actually, it was just surveyors out to the western part of Virginia and Pennsylvania. And they crossed over into Ohio and they started to survey. So they were measuring all this land out in the west. And basically, they found out that there was already a group of people here who were sort of opposed to the surveying and the opening of the West. And that, of course, was the Native Americans, and they were hostile. And there was also settlers who had come out into Ohio illegally to set up their homesteads and things. And so the surveyors came out and they decided that they didn't really want to stay out here and survey the property unless they had a military escort. So in other words, unless they had soldiers with them to help protect the surveying group against the Native Americans and also the settlers who were out here, the pioneers. So in 1785, they go back to Pittsburgh, which is right here. They went back to the Fort Pitt. Before that, it was Fort Duquesne. And basically, they told the federal government that they would not go back out there unless they had soldiers to go with them. So in 1786, in the spring of 1786, the 1st American Regiment went out with the surveyors out here in the west to survey this part of Ohio. And in this part of the world, we call it the 7 ranges. And that is basically the 7 surveying ranges, starting from the point of beginning, which is in East Liverpool. And that's a picture of the monument of the point of beginning. And so basically out in West Virginia and the eastern part of our country, they survey by what we call leaps and bounds. So they use natural signs to sort of have their points for surveying. So they would say 100 feet to a rock, and then another 100 feet to a big tree, and then another 100 feet to a stream or river, and they would sort of confine your space based off of natural things. But in Ohio, they didn't want to do that. They wanted to do a grid system and ranges and townships and sections. And that's basically where they started from the point of beginning. So actually, if you look at a map from this point all the way to the Pacific Ocean, you will see a very nice grid system of survey and land and things like that. And it all started here in East Liverpool, actually, the point of beginning here at Fort Steuben. So that's how we are part of the national story. So anyway, 1786, the soldiers go out with the surveyors, and they go out and they survey. And they are protected from the hostile Native Americans. And not only are they surveying, but they're also kicking out the squatters, the pioneers, because they're not allowed to be here. So they ask them to please leave. And sometimes they're actually a little violent with them. They actually burn down their houses if they don't leave. So they're kicking them out. They're moving these people back into Virginia, or they're asking them that eventually when the land becomes available for purchase, they can buy some. But anyway, so the soldiers are here. They basically need a winter camp around October of 1786, and they start to build Fort Steuben. And right over here, we have a great model. And we're going to go out there in just a minute. But basically, this is a model of the fort that they built. And it's a pretty neat thing. So basically, this is a good overview in this circumstance to tell you a little bit about the building. So we've got the guardhouse, and we're going to look at that. This is the sally port, or the gatehouse. This part would have been facing the river. You have the blockhouses. These buildings in the corners are the blockhouses. They were the first buildings to be built when the soldiers came to this part of the world. Now, there's no Steubenville. It did not exist in 1786 and 1787. In fact, Steubenville takes its name from the fort, Fort Steuben. Now, Baron von Steuben, who is the name of the fellow that the fort is named for, he was never here. He never came to Steubenville. But he was a general during the American Revolution, and some of the officers of the soldiers who were here actually fought in the American Revolution, and they served under Baron von Steuben. So they actually named the fort in his honor. And letters were written to the Baron to let him know that this fort was built and named for him, and he was very happy to hear that, but he never actually visited Fort Steuben. So some of the other buildings, we have the commissary. That's where sort of they got their food. It's kind of like the mess hall, sort of, where they were given food, but they couldn't cook it there. They didn't make it there. And then we've got the hospital right here. Over here, you've got the blacksmith shop. You've got the quartermaster who handled all the stuff, and we're going to go in there in just a minute. And then you have these two buildings on the end. Those two long buildings with the 4 windows each. Those are officer quarters and the place where the surveyors would stay. Okay. Do you want to do questions? Is there any questions? I don't know how your platform works.
Yeah. Does anybody have any questions? Raise your hand and I'll try to see if anybody's asking anything.
We go out.
Harrison. Let me try to, hold on, let me try. No, it's not gonna let me unmute you. Just type it in the comments, okay, and we'll get to you. All right, let's take a walk.
Now, I guess maybe I should tell you a little bit about this stuff too before we go out, since it's so neat. These are Native American artifacts, and some of these artifacts actually date back thousands of years. Thousands of years. So, for instance, this thing right here, this is kind of like it's called an adze. It's something that they used to like chop things with, chop wood, the Native Americans here. This thing probably was made about 4,000 years ago. So there's lots of points here that are pretty old. And some of the longer points, those things are probably at least 4,000, maybe 5,000 years old. And this one too, right here, this is about 5,000 years old as well. Now, a lot of these things came from right across the river where there was an ancient Native American Indian encampment. There was a village up there called the Panhandle Archaic period. So when we talk about habitation here, so when we talk about who's here in human history of settlement here in the Ohio Valley, this area has been continuously inhabited for over 5,000 years, which is pretty cool. All right, so let's go out to the fort.
Thank you.
All right. Now, one of the things I'll mention is that you're going to see a lot of these little black bees that float around here. They love the wood of the fort. And when we have visitors here, we tell them that unless you have a wooden head, they won't bother you. Okay, they're pretty tame little guys. But you'll see mountains of them all over.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so we're out here at historic Fort Steuben, and yeah, they'll get you those little books. And this is a monument that was put up by the people of Steubenville over many years, trying to get the fort to be rebuilt. So the fort, and I didn't tell you this in the introduction, but the fort is only occupied for about 8 months or so. It's a winter camp, so they weren't here for a long time. But when the soldiers leave in May of 1787, the fort basically is abandoned. No one lives here, as far as we know. And sometime between 1787 and 1790, this fort disappears. We don't know if it was burned down. The thought is that the place burned down. I don't believe it's burned down because we've done a lot of archaeology here. So in other words, they dig into the ground and they're looking for objects that talk about the fort. They found some things from the fort, but there's no evidence at all that the buildings burned down. So what I think personally is that when settlers came back in here after the soldiers and the surveyors left, they found a great quarry for all this wood. And so they took the wood apart, they took the buildings apart, and they actually used them for their own buildings, or they lived in the buildings. So they did use these buildings. So that's why the fort sort of disappears from the archaeological record. They would have seen it. So there was lots of pushes to try to get the fort rebuilt. And they decided in 1913 to put these monuments up to sort of mark where the forts were, or where the four corners of the forts were. So this is one of the four, and this one actually should have been out in the park, but we decided to bring it in here to sort of protect it. But there's four of these. Of the four, there's only two that have the original copper plates that tell you a little bit about the fort. So it's a pretty neat thing. All right, so the first building we're going to go into is actually this building here, and this is the officers' quarters. Mind the bugs. Okay, so this is the officers' quarters, and what you see in this space is actually pretty similar to what the soldiers and the officers would have experienced here at Fort Steuben. The one difference that you'll see in a lot of these buildings is that we don't have the fireplaces because, you know, we're a nonprofit, so we don't, you know, we didn't have a lot of funds. We did the best we could with the construction of these buildings, but we do lack the fireplaces that they would have. So there would have been a great big fireplace in the center. There would have been a fireplace between these two rooms over here, and there would have been a fireplace in that building. So in this space. So it was pretty nice and toasty in this room. Okay. So first of all, we'll start right here. This is Hamtramck's, Captain Hamtramck's quarters. Now, Captain Hamtramck was the commander of this fort. He was the most senior officer. So because of that, he got his own room, which was pretty fancy. He has a bed that could be taken apart and moved with him. It's a pretty small bed, but it would have been effective. It has the bed curtains, the bedclothes there that could be closed to keep bugs out and to keep drafts out. The little thing on his bed, that little circle thing with the long handle, that thing actually is a bed warmer. That would be used. They could fill that with coals and run it through the sheets right before Captain Hamtramck got into bed. So he had a nice warm bed to climb into. The pot on the floor next to the bed is a chamber pot or a necessary pot. That pot was actually used as their bathroom. You did not want to trek out to the cold latrines here at Fort Steuben, which they did have, which were actually outside of the fort walls for the regular soldiers. And of course, lots of equipment here, swords, powder horns, camp packs. This box here is actually an exact replica of the one that Captain Hamtramck had here at historic Fort Steuben. The original is at West Point, so we were able to see it and make an exact replica of that. So very similar to what the captain would have had here. But he had a very nice room. Now, Captain Hamtramck also did have a cook with him. And so the cook would be working in this space right here. This is the kitchen. Now you'll see a stove in the back, and there was no stove here at Fort Steuben. They had fireplaces that cooked over the fireplace, although stoves were invented at that time. Now, Captain Hamtramck had his own cook. It was an enlisted soldier. The fort could accommodate about 150 soldiers. There was about 123 who were here, not including the officers. So there was some guys here. Now, the soldiers themselves had to be responsible for cooking their own food, but Captain Hamtramck did have his own cook who worked here. They cooked for him and also the officers and the surveyors. Now out here, this is the main, what we would call the parlor at historic Fort Steuben in the officers' quarters. The table was set here for dinner. They would probably eat around 3 or 4 in the afternoon. their main meal of the day because, you know, it gets dark at night and they didn't have a lot of candles and a lot of lamps. But, you know, they had to conserve the daylight and eat when they didn't have to light all these candles and things because it was hard to get. The soldiers were rationed candles, but again, you didn't want to use all your stuff. This thing right here in the center, that's actually a sugar cone. And so that's what the soldiers and the officers would have used to sweeten their food, although it would have looked a little different. It wouldn't have been the white pure sugar that we have today. Now this is a mannequin here. This is a display of what a soldier, an officer would have worn. He wears the blue jacket, and he's got the little epaulette that says that he's an officer. Now all of the officers had to be clean shaven. So I would never make it as an officer. So they would actually use a straight razor, of course, and soap to wash their face and be clean shaven. So you had to do that. It was Army regulations. And one of the things that they used for Army regulations was a drill manual that was made by Baron von Steuben. Actually, they used his drill manual. And in fact, parts of it are still used today. Of the drill manual that Baron von Steuben wrote during the American Revolution. So, you know, his impact is pretty lasting. Okay, now in this space right here, this is where the surveyors and the officers would have slept. And we have got some very tall officers and surveyors who are who are in this space right now. And the space that these guys have, it's pretty nice. They've got their own beds. They've got rope beds. So in other words, ropes that are holding up the feather tick that they would have had. And if you've heard the expression sleep tight, don't let the bed bugs bite at night, it comes from the rope bed. Sleep tight means that your ropes on your bed are nice and tight. Otherwise, you'll sink towards the floor and you'll have a very uncomfortable night. And of course you understand the bed bugs part. So we hope we didn't have any bed bugs. But anyway, so this is where the officers and the surveyors would have slept. Now the next building, just to the left of this building that we're in right now, that space is what we use today as a historian hall. It is not open today. But that space would have looked exactly like this would have looked like. So they had two buildings identical to this space. One other thing before we leave this space is this map. So we get a lot of questions out in the fort about how we know, since the fort was only occupied for such a short amount of time, how we know what the fort looked like and what all the buildings were. And, you know, did it look like this or did it look something different? So basically we have a great primary source of evidence about what the fort looked like in the 18th century. So basically in 1787, in January of 1787, after the soldiers had been here and they were working to put it back, you know, build all the buildings and get everything going, Captain Hamtramck got a message saying that the Paymaster General of the United States Army was going to come and visit the fort. So he basically got everything ready. He got the fort totally completed because they were still working on it. And basically, when the Paymaster General came here, he had one of his aides, a fellow by the name of Frothingham, draw a map exactly of the fort. Show exactly the buildings, the measurements, where the fireplaces were, where the buildings were, the space, how big the fort was, had it all written down. And this gentleman, the Paymaster General, kept the map, kept it in his journal. And his name was Beatty. His last name was Beatty. Now, Beatty goes back east. He gets married. He moves to, I think, Connecticut or something up in the New England states. And he basically lives the rest of his life out there. Now, he has a son. And this guy was Charles Beatty. Charles Beatty actually became a Presbyterian minister. He was a preacher. He actually was stationed in Steubenville. Much later in the 1820s, he comes back to Steubenville. He has his father's journals from being Paymaster General, and wouldn't you know it, lo and behold, they find the original map of Fort Steuben in Charles Beatty's father's papers. So he kept that map, and he lived to a good long old age. And he actually had the map published in the local newspaper. an actual photocopy that was in the paper in the 1870s. And we have, and this is a copy of that map. So historically, we've always had a picture of what the fort would look like. And it's just by sheer coincidence that the map actually did make it back to Steubenville with Beatty's son. So that's why we know exactly how the fort looked, how big it was, and you know, which buildings were which. So when visitors come, we have that great resource to share. This is it. Okay. All right, let's move on to the next building. Now, one of the things that we tell visitors is that, you know, this is a winter camp. So you imagine lots of snow here. It's hard to imagine on this beautiful sunny day, but there was tons of snow here. The river was frozen when the soldiers got here. So they were able to cross the river into Virginia pretty easily. But on the other hand, that made getting supplies very difficult. They would get supplies from Pittsburgh, which was still part of Virginia at that particular moment. And there was a fort there, of course, Fort Pitt. And there were some other forts up and down the Ohio River between here and there. But their supplies were supposed to all come in from there. Now, there were some points when they couldn't get supplies. So especially in December and January, it was very difficult to get anything here. So they actually hired some hunters from across the river in Virginia to help supply the soldiers with food. Now, this is a really cool stone. I don't know how good it's going to come up on the screen, but we've got some markings on this stone. Now, remember when we first started this, I told you about the surveyors and how important they were to the history and the story of Fort Steuben. So this is basically a surveying stone that when the surveyors would go out, originally they would put like wooden spokes in the, like wooden sticks in the ground or iron rods to sort of measure the land. Now later on, around the 1820s and 1830s, they changed them and made something like this. This is a stone, surveying stone, that basically tells you where you are in relationship to the land. So this is a backwards S, okay? But this would have been Section 8, Township 5, Range 2. It looks like a 9, but it's actually a 2. And so we could actually go back and look at a map and tell you exactly where this stone came from. And actually on Route 7, just below us, between here and Wheeling, they were widening the road, and they actually found this up on the hill that was placed originally in 1830. And the reason we know why it says 1830 is because on the back, it's actually carved 1830. And you've got a compass point right here that you could orient your land to the north, south, east, and west. All right, back here, you'll see that the 1830. It's really hard to see.
Here it is.
All right. Okay. Now this is another blockhouse. This building is going to be a surveying museum eventually, so it's closed right now. But we're going to go into at least 2 of them. Okay, so this is the quartermaster's building. So basically, what the quartermaster did was supply the soldiers with stuff. So their blankets, their uniforms, their guns, their pots and pans, and anything sort of that soldiers would need, not food, but anything else that the soldiers would need for daily life here at the fort. We do have some pelts on the table. And the reason we have pelts here is to explain that this area, even at this time in the 1780s and even prior to that, this area was basically the center of the fur trade in the early American history. And in fact, before the American Revolution, the French and Indian War, basically this area was the epicenter of a world conflict, the French and Indian War, we call it here in America, but over in Europe, they call it the 7 Years' War. So it was a global conflict. One of the first world wars, really, about control over this Ohio River Valley. And it was all basically the fur trade. The fur trade supplied Europe with furs and skins and things like that for their fashions. Now, I know it's going to be hard to see here over the phone and the video call, but this is a muskrat fur. This, of course, is a skunk. This is a fox. This is a rabbit. These, of course, are turtles. This is beaver. This is another beaver. This is a, what is this? Oh, a raccoon. Very soft raccoon. And this, of course, is a deer, white-tailed deer. Now, the most expensive fur and the most desirable fur and skin in this area, of course, was the beaver. Beaver was most expensive. And the reason for that is that beavers live in water, of course, and they build little dams and things like this. The beaver skin is waterproof, naturally waterproof. So you didn't have to do anything different, anything else to make a hat or a piece of clothing with beaver skin because it was already waterproof. And that made it highly desirable. And that made the furs very, very expensive. So this was one of the things that people tried to get a hold of pretty quick. Some other things, we've got lots of tools and different things hanging here, lots of equipment. We've got blankets. Let's see what else. Now the fort did not have a well, but they got their water from the river. So they would actually have to lift these things up and go down to the river to fetch water and bring it back up here with this yoke. And so they're pretty heavy.
Bet.
It'd be pretty strong to move that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right.
Sure, the river was a lot cleaner than it is now.
Probably a lot cleaner. Not quite as deep though, shallow, much more shallower. You could actually walk across most of the river except the channel, the main part of the river. And that's because in today's world, they have, to make the river navigable, they've dammed up the river. So that makes it like 13 or 14 feet deep. But it historically had never been like that until about 1810 or so.
Oh, wow.
In the lock system. So when we hear stories about the river freezing, it's really difficult for us because it's such a big body of water.
Right.
But in that time, when you have the couple feet deep,
It'd be nothing for it to freeze, right?
Right. And one of the things we did lose with the lock and dam system that this way. One of the things we did lose with the locks and dams is that there were lots of Native American petroglyphs. So in other words, along the river, there's these giant rocks that stuck out. And so the Native Americans actually went down and carved designs and their language and pictographs and things on those giant rocks that survived up until the time they dammed the river. And when they dammed them, they all went underwater. So they're probably still there. There's a great book that was written about 1910 or so. This guy went out with a camera and took pictures of a lot of them. And so we're lucky that we have those. Almost got me. Okay, this is the blacksmith shop. And the one difference, well, there's a couple differences, but one of the differences about this space and what they would have had originally is that this building would not have been connected to the palisade, so the fence, the big fence that goes around the fort. Because if this building caught on fire, because they're a blacksmith, they're working with hot, fire, the forge and things, they would not have liked to have had this next to the palisade because in case this building burned down, it wouldn't burn down the rest of the fort. Okay, so they had it separate. Now, the blacksmith was not a soldier. He was not a surveyor. He was an independent contractor. He was a guy that the government hired to come out with the soldiers. It was a dangerous job, of course. You're coming out here to the western part of the frontier at this particular moment, and basically there's lots of Native Americans out here, hostile Native Americans, and you're with a group of soldiers out at the front, so it was dangerous. But the good thing about being an independent contractor here, the blacksmith or the artificer basically means that you can do lots of different things. You don't just work in iron, you can work in wood and leather and other things. The good thing about being one of those guys is that you had your own bed, which is right over here. You had your own space, so you didn't have to share a bed, and we'll talk about that as we go on. Now, some of the equipment in here, we've got lots of saws and lots of draw knives and a drill press right over here. And this thing is a cobbler's station where they would make shoes. And one thing I do want to show you, which is really cool, is this vise right here. And basically all the shingles, so the things that go up on the roof, are made out of wood, basically like this. And they get a piece, and they open this up, and they put their feet down on this to hold everything together. And they get this straw knife, and they can draw in shape the shingles. Now, I am inexperienced in this job, okay? But if you were doing this for a living, you would be well aware because you're bringing the sharp blade towards you, which could be very dangerous. So what a trick of using this contraption is that you have your elbows and squish them right against your belly, your ribs. So you're not going to lose it and you can't hurt yourself with it. So anyway, that's basically what they would do to shape some of the shingles and things. And they could use this for lots of different applications. Anything really that you need to hold in place to work with. So it's a really neat contraption. And this is a reproduction. We've got some original old ones in another space. All right.
What time is it?
26,
Okay.
so we better hustle. Okay. Now this is the blacksmith shop. This is where the blacksmith would have actually worked. It doesn't look like what they would have had originally. It would have been a brick forge. This is a more modern bellows, but this is where all the action would happen, where they heat the metal. And when we do open up, sometimes we have blacksmiths that come out and work here. So it's really awesome.
It's neat.
Now I want to make sure we get through most of the building, so we're going to go a little faster. All right, this is the enlisted men's space. We've got some of our tall enlisted men who are working here at the fort. Now, most of the soldiers who are here are anywhere between 15 to 18 years old. Young guys. Most of them could not read or write, had no education whatsoever, and really had only joined the Army for clothing and a warm roof and food, basically is why these guys joined up. The average pay for an enlisted man at this particular moment was $4 a month, and like Captain Hamtramck was making $45 a month, so there's a big disparity there. Now you see all these bunks. Now, this building could accommodate about 28 soldiers. There's not 28 beds here. There's supposed to be 14 soldiers on each side of the big fireplace. Basically, the soldiers would have to share a bunk. So when one soldier was out working and out doing their duty, one guy could be sleeping or cooking or whatever, and then they would switch off, basically what would happen here. Now, all the soldiers were responsible for cooking their own food. And this is a double-sided fireplace. It's the same on the other side. And there was a fireman here, and his job was of not just to make sure that the buildings didn't burn down because of improper fire handling, but to make sure that the fire did not go out. It's a big job. If you let the fire go out, you were punished. So these beds are not quite as comfortable as the nice rope beds we saw in some of the other rooms. They've got wooden slats, and they sort of angle down towards where your feet would be, because that was common in the 18th century to sort of sleep propped up. That's why you see beds and they're real short. They slept propped up instead of like flat
Makes
down
sense.
like we do. Okay, this is a homemade raft. Probably what some of the settlers would have come down the Ohio River on. There was actually a family who traveled the Ohio River from Pittsburgh on that thing. That's why we have it. I wouldn't do that. We can go if you want to go up here. All right, this is the Sally Port of the gatehouse. And up here, you can get a great view of the whole area. Dodging big insects.
Go ahead.
So this is a beautiful view of the river. There's a boat going down it right now. You've got the Market Street Bridge right over there. And that bridge was built in 1905. So it's a pretty old bridge. And you've got West Virginia over there. At that time when the fort was built, it was Virginia. you can get a good idea about why the fort was built here. We're up on this plateau. You've got two other spaces down. That's a water treatment plant down there for the city of Steubenville. Now, when the soldiers were here, they would have cleared everything out. All the trees would have been cut down to build the fort, number one, but also to give them a view of the river. Let's see. And you can still see over there one of the original monuments that's missing its plate, and there's another one on that side. But in that Native American village, I wanted to tell you guys was up there, actually, right where the hillside goes down to the first step down before it really goes down on the very tippy top. That's 300 feet up. There was an ancient Native American village up there where a lot of the artifacts you saw came from. The Panhandle Archaic, which is pretty cool stuff.
That's good.
And on most of the hilltops above the river, there was probably Native American Indian camps. They have found a lot of
Go, baby.
Now this thing over here, these are the stock and the pillory. The fort did not have these. They're fun because we get lots of good pictures when visitors come. And then when they get inside, they did not have these. And you'd put your arms in here and your head sticking out there and people could throw rotten fruit at you. But the fort didn't have this. The fort actually had a whipping post. I'm not sure which one that is. Probably this.
I think so.
Now, the city of Steubenville also had a whipping post. The city of Wellsburg in West Virginia, at that time it was called Charlestown, they had a stock. They did not have a. Okay, now this is the Frontier Camp. And basically this building, this is another one of the blockhouses. So originally it would have looked like the last building that we were in with the soldiers and the big fireplace in the center. But we decided to build this and show you how soldiers and hunters would camp out in the wilderness.
Slide over here.
There's lots of different things to see in here. You've got the tent, of course, with our hunter, or maybe even a soldier. But he's in hunting garb here. He's got lots of camp equipment. He's got this little stove here. He's got another stove that cooked his coffee. He's got his gun and his canteen, and he has furs hanging up here. And these are hammers. They're sort of crudely fashioned hammers, but they were probably used to build something like this. Was used to build a lot of these buildings. Now the buildings, of course, in today's world, they're built with nails and things like this. But when the fort was built, the pins were made out of wood. It was all mortise and tenon joints and wooden joints and things. Now we've got our Native American friends here. They would not have been permitted inside the fort, but here they are. And this is another one of the original vices that we have, an old looking one. Like I showed you in the blacksmith shop where you could hold a piece of wood inside that vice.
Wow. Pretty cool.
And these objects here, these are just different equipment that is typical of the time. You've got the early Native American things that are made out of wood and natural things. You've got axes and things to sort of dig out canoes. You've got cooking utensils here. This is kind of like where you would put a pot on over a fire. This is a coffee grinder. So it's a pretty small thing. And lots of different screws and forks and different things. These are hunting objects and trapping objects. On this side, you've got the powder horn. And this thing is a little tinder box where you would put a little candle. So it's kind of like a flashlight these days. And lots of different knives. So lots of equipment here on the walls.
Really cool.
All right, let's move on. We've got 2 more buildings to go. I know we can make it. We'll hustle. And as we walk, I'll just tell you that this fence in the middle, this is our ongoing archaeological excavations that have been going on here since 1978. And they're not working right now, of course, because nothing is working. But they're still digging. They constantly are digging here. at the fort. Now this is the hospital. Lots of different objects here at the hospital. A surgery going on, a fellow by the name of Dr. John Elliott, who actually was the doctor at the fort. As far as we know, there was no surgery or anything that happened here, but this is sort of what one may have looked like. And lots of different pieces of equipment that the doctor could have used. Basically what the doctor did at Fort Steuben was treat cuts and things and give out medicine, basically what he did. And we do have a list of the types of medicines that the doctor did have. We have a lot more than that, but we do have lists that tell you exactly what they have. And one of the things that we always hear when you see any kind of surgery, they say, that the soldiers may not have had a lot of, anesthetics, so things to numb the pain. Now, at Fort Steuben, they did. They had something called laudanum, which was wine mixed with opium. So they were pretty much not feeling anything during surgery if they had to do it. All right. So we'll move to our last building. And I would encourage all of you to come out to Fort Steuben. I've given you just a little taste of what we have here at the fort and sort of the history. So if you want the full-blown tour, please come and visit us when we open up. Okay, this is the commissary. And basically, this gentleman was in charge of securing the food for the soldiers. And as I mentioned, most of the soldiers, well, all the enlisted men have to cook their own food. And so they would come here to get their rations, basically. So they've got beef, flour, bacon, whiskey. The officers probably had a box like this that had chocolate in it for hot chocolate, which was a very popular drink in the 18th century. Coffee, of course, and lots of fine wines and brandies and things like that.
Wow.
So we've got a deer hanging here. The deer probably was not, there was no deer inside. They probably had them outside. And a lot of these hanging animals and things, they would have those outside, of course, until they were ready to eat them. Soldiers were not permitted to hunt for themselves. They had rations. They had to get rations themselves. When the soldiers were lacking in meat and things like this, they actually hired, I think I mentioned, they hired a guy from over in Virginia to hunt for them. So that's basically what they did. So this is all the food.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming and talking with us, Paul. And guys, come visit whenever you get a chance.
Please do.
Bye. I'm going to toss it over to Aaron. Let me see. Let me find Aaron here. Oh, Aaron. There we go. Let me unmute you. No, you're good, Aaron.
Perfect. That was a spectacular tour. Thank you, Paul and Amanda, for taking us through the Fort Steuben and learning so much about the valuable history that comes from our area and that region. Paul, that was a great tour. It really was. I'm from Mingo Junction originally, so I love the Native American history. Obviously, that town's named after the Mingo Indians. So Mike and I would grow up in the woods, finding arrowheads and things like that. So it was. Oh yeah, it comes full circle. So thank you so much, sir. We really appreciate your time, and Amanda for giving us that great tour of the Fort Steuben. So
thank you.
All right. Well, we'll take a short break and then we'll be back live from Gallia County. So come back and join us, everybody.
Bye, guys.